Have you ever reached a moment that was supposed to feel like enough, and yet, it didn't? Maybe you achieved something you once dreamed about. Maybe you improved yourself, worked harder, became better. And still, there was that quiet voice in the background, whispering, "Not yet, not enough." It doesn't shout. It doesn't demand attention. But it shapes how you see yourself, how you measure your life, and how you move through the world. And the strange part is, you may have believed that voice for so long, you no longer question where it came from. What if that voice is not telling you the truth? What if the feeling of not enough is not a reflection of your reality, but a pattern you've learned to repeat? From a young age, we are taught to improve, to achieve, to become more. And while growth is natural, somewhere along the way, we begin to tie our worth to progress. We start believing that who we are right now is simply a temporary version, an unfinished draft waiting to be validated. And so, we postpone peace. We delay self-acceptance. We convince ourselves that one day, after just a little more effort, we will finally feel whole. This is an invitation to pause that cycle. Not by giving up on growth, but by changing the foundation beneath it. Because building a life where you are enough does not mean settling. It means removing the constant pressure of proving your worth. It means learning how to exist without the weight of comparison, without the fear of falling behind, without the endless need for approval. It means discovering a quieter, steadier way of living, where your value is not something you chase, but something you recognize. As we move forward, you will begin to see how your thoughts shape your identity, how hidden standards influence your emotions, and how your mind quietly creates the feeling of lack. You will learn how to observe that process without being controlled by it. And slowly, something begins to shift. Not all at once, but gently, like a tension you didn't realize you were holding, finally starting to release. So take a breath. There is nothing you need to prove here. Nothing you need to become before you begin. You are already enough to start. And it begins with understanding one simple truth. The voice inside your head is not who you are. Chapter 1. The voice inside your head is not you. There is a moment that happens so quietly, most people never notice it. You are going about your day, maybe walking, maybe working, maybe just sitting with your thoughts, and suddenly a sentence appears in your mind. You're behind. Or you should be doing more. Or why can't you be better than this? It feels immediate, personal, and true. It feels like you. And because it feels like you, you rarely question it. You simply accept it, and then you respond by pushing harder, doubting yourself, or shrinking just a little more. But here is something subtle and deeply important. That voice is not actually you. It is something you experience, not something you are. The problem is not that the voice exists. Every human mind produces thoughts, constantly and automatically. The problem is that we have learned to identify with every thought that passes through us, as if it defines us. We don't observe the voice, we become it. And once that happens, we stop having a relationship with our thoughts, and instead, we are controlled by them. Imagine sitting beside a river, watching leaves float on the surface. Each leaf represents a thought. Some are calm and harmless. Others are sharp, critical, or heavy. Now imagine that instead of sitting on the riverbank, you are in the water, clinging to every leaf that passes by. You grab one that says you're not good enough, and suddenly, you are no longer observing that thought, you are inside it. You feel it. You believe it. You carry it with you. And by the time the next thought arrives, you are already weighed down. This is how most people live their entire lives. Not because they are weak, but because they were never taught that there is another way. From childhood, you absorb voices from everywhere: parents, teachers, society, expectations. Over time, those voices blend together and become internal. They start to sound like your own. And because they are familiar, they feel true. But familiarity is not the same as truth. A thought repeated often enough can feel permanent, even if it is built on misunderstanding. Think about how often your mind speaks in extremes. It says always, never, everyone, no one. It simplifies complex situations into rigid conclusions. One mistake becomes I always mess things up. One comparison becomes I'll never be as good as them. This is not careful thinking. This is pattern-based thinking, fast, automatic, and often inaccurate. Yet because it happens inside your own mind, you rarely challenge it. You assume that if you thought it, it must be valid. But you are not the voice that judges you. You are the awareness that hears it. This distinction may seem small at first, but it changes everything. When you begin to see your thoughts as events rather than identities, a space opens up. And in that space, something new becomes possible. You no longer have to react immediately. You no longer have to accept every thought as a command. Instead, you can notice it, pause, and choose how to respond. The voice may still speak, but it no longer has absolute authority. Consider a simple moment. You make a small mistake, something ordinary, something human. Immediately, the voice appears, "That was stupid. You should know better." In the past, this thought would pull you in instantly. You would feel embarrassed, frustrated, maybe even ashamed. But now, imagine hearing that same thought from a slight distance. You notice it. You recognize its tone. And instead of agreeing with it, you ask a quiet question. Is that actually true? Not as an argument, but as curiosity. Something shifts. The thought loses some of its weight. Not because you forced it away, but because you stopped feeding it with automatic belief. And in that moment, you experience a kind of freedom, not from having no thoughts, but from not being controlled by them. This is the beginning of emotional strength. Not the ability to silence your mind, but the ability to not be defined by it. Many people believe that the goal is to think positively all the time. To replace every negative thought with a better one. But this often becomes another form of pressure. Another standard to fail. The mind does not work that way. It produces all kinds of thoughts, helpful, unhelpful, kind, critical. The goal is not to control which thoughts appear. The goal is to change your relationship with them. You can think of the voice in your head as a narrator that developed over time. It tries to make sense of your experiences, to protect you, to guide you. But it is not always accurate. Sometimes it is outdated. Sometimes it is overly harsh. And sometimes it repeats things that were never yours to begin with. If you listen carefully, you may even recognize familiar tones, phrases that sound like something you heard years ago, now playing on repeat in your own mind. This is why awareness matters so deeply. Because once you see the voice clearly, you begin to separate from it. And once you separate from it, you are no longer trapped inside its perspective. You can question it. You can soften it. You can choose not to follow it. This does not happen instantly. It is a gradual process, like adjusting your vision after being in the dark. At first, everything feels the same. But slowly, details begin to emerge. There will still be moments when the voice feels overwhelming. Moments when it speaks loudly, convincingly, and with urgency. That is part of being human. But even in those moments, there is a small space, sometimes just a second, where you can remember, this is a thought, not a fact. That reminder alone can change how deeply the thought affects you. It gives you just enough distance to breathe, to pause, to not react automatically. Over time, this practice builds something quiet but powerful. A sense of inner stability. Not because your thoughts become perfect, but because your identity is no longer tied to them. You begin to experience yourself as something deeper than your mental noise. Something steady, even when your mind is not. And from that steadiness, a new kind of confidence begins to grow. Not loud or performative, but calm and grounded. This is where the idea of being enough starts to take root. Because as long as you believe every critical thought, you will always feel like you are falling short. The voice will always find something to fix, something to improve, something to question. But when you stop identifying with that voice, you begin to see that your worth was never actually defined by it. It was only ever described by it, and often, described poorly. You are not the voice that tells you you're behind. You are the one who notices that thought and continues anyway. You are not the voice that says you're not enough. You are the one who hears it, questions it, and chooses how to move forward. This shift is subtle, but it is the foundation of everything that follows. Because once you realize that you are not your thoughts, you are no longer limited by them. And yet, even as this awareness grows, another layer begins to reveal itself. If the voice inside your head is not truly you, then where did it come from? Why does it sound the way it does? Why does it push you in certain directions and hold you back in others? To understand that, we need to look a little deeper, beyond the voice itself, and into the invisible standards that quietly shape it. Chapter 2: The Invisible Standard That Controls Your Life. There is something even quieter than the voice in your head. Something that sits behind it, shaping what that voice says, what it expects, and how it judges you. You don't hear it directly. You don't question it often. And yet, it influences nearly every feeling of pressure, disappointment, or inadequacy you experience. It is the invisible standard, the unspoken rulebook you carry within you about how life should look, how you should behave, and who you should become. You don't remember choosing this standard. That's what makes it so powerful. It formed gradually, through moments that seemed small at the time. A comment from a parent. A comparison in school. A subtle shift in how people treated you when you succeeded or failed. Over time, these moments began to build a quiet expectation inside you. Not always clear, not always logical, but deeply felt. And without realizing it, you began measuring yourself against it. Imagine a young student sitting in a classroom, holding a test paper with a score that is objectively good. But instead of feeling proud, they feel a quiet disappointment. Not because the result is poor, but because it doesn't match an internal expectation. Somewhere along the way, good stopped being enough. Only the perfect felt acceptable. That shift doesn't come from the test itself. It comes from the invisible standard that has been silently raised, again and again, until anything less feels like failure. As you grow older, this standard doesn't disappear. It evolves. It attaches itself to new areas of life. Your career, your relationships, your appearance, your progress. It begins to whisper things like, you should be further ahead by now, or other people are doing better, or this is not what your life was supposed to look like. And because this standard feels internal, it feels like truth. You don't see it as a constructed expectation. You see it as reality. But here is the deeper truth. Much of what you believe you should be is not something you consciously decided. It is something you absorbed. You learned it by watching others, by interpreting reactions, by trying to belong. And while some of those influences may have been helpful, many were incomplete or unrealistic. They were shaped by other people's fears, values, and limitations, then quietly passed on to you. This is why the standard often feels impossible to reach. Because it was never designed with your full humanity in mind. It doesn't account for your pace, your struggles, your individuality. It only reflects an idealized version of life, a polished image that ignores the complexity behind it. And yet, you hold yourself accountable to it as if it were a fair and accurate measure. Think about how often you compare your current reality to a version of life that exists only in fragments. You see someone's success, but not their uncertainty. You notice someone's confidence, but not their doubt. You observe outcomes, but not the process that led to them. And then, without realizing it, your internal standard adjusts. It rises just a little higher. It becomes just a little harder to meet. This is not because you are doing something wrong. It is because the mind naturally fills in gaps with assumptions. It creates complete stories from incomplete information. And those stories become the benchmarks you measure yourself against. Over time, this creates a constant sense of being behind, even when you are moving forward. Because the finish line keeps shifting. There is also a subtle emotional cost to living under an invisible standard. It changes how you experience your own life. Moments that could feel satisfying become temporary. Achievements feel incomplete. Progress feels insufficient. You begin to move through life not with a sense of presence, but with a sense of evaluation. Always checking, always measuring, always asking, is this enough yet? And because the answer rarely feels like yes, the cycle continues. But what if the problem is not your progress, but the standard itself? What if the quiet pressure you feel is not a sign that you need to do more, but a signal that something within you needs to be questioned? This is where awareness becomes more than observation, it becomes inquiry. You begin to gently examine the expectations you carry. Not to reject them immediately, but to understand them. You might notice that some of your standards are based on timelines that were never truly yours. Ideas about where you should be at a certain age. Milestones that were defined by others, then adopted without reflection. You might begin to see how these timelines create urgency, even when there is no real need to rush. How they turn your life into a race that you never consciously agreed to run. You might also notice how your standard changes depending on who you compare yourself to. Around one group of people, you feel accomplished. Around another, you feel behind. This alone reveals something important. If your sense of enough can shift so easily, then it was never stable to begin with. It was never an objective truth. It was always relative, always influenced, always adjustable. And if it can be adjusted unconsciously, it can also be adjusted consciously. This is not about lowering your standards in a way that removes growth or ambition. It is about making your standards real, grounded, aligned with your actual life, not an imagined version of it. It is about creating expectations that support you, rather than quietly diminish you. Because a standard that constantly makes you feel inadequate is not guiding you, it is exhausting you. There is a different way to approach growth. One that does not rely on constant comparison or unreachable ideals. It begins with a simple shift in perspective. Instead of asking, "Am I where I should be?" you begin to ask, "Am I moving in a direction that feels true to me?" This question does not remove ambition. It refines it. It brings it closer to your own values, rather than someone else's expectations. When you begin to live this way, something interesting happens. The pressure starts to soften. Not because you stop caring, but because you stop measuring yourself against a moving target. You begin to experience your life more directly. Your progress becomes something you feel, not something you constantly evaluate. And in that shift, a quiet sense of sufficiency begins to grow. This does not mean the invisible standard disappears overnight. It will still appear, still whisper familiar expectations. But now, you recognize it. You see it for what it is, a learned framework, not an absolute truth. And that recognition gives you a choice. You can follow it, or you can question it. You can let it define your worth, or you can redefine what worth means to you. Over time, this choice becomes easier. Not because the standard loses all influence, but because your awareness becomes stronger. You begin to trust your own pace. You begin to respect your own path. And most importantly, you begin to understand that your life does not need to look a certain way to be meaningful. There is a quiet freedom in that realization. A sense that you are no longer chasing an invisible finish line. That you are no longer living under a set of rules you never agreed to. And in that freedom, something deeper begins to emerge, not just acceptance, but clarity. A clearer understanding of what actually matters to you, beyond expectation, beyond comparison. Because once you start to question the standard, another question naturally follows. If the expectations you've been chasing were never truly yours, then why does the feeling of not enough still persist, even when you achieve them? To understand that, we need to look at something even more subtle, the endless cycle of wanting more, and why reaching your goals rarely feels as satisfying as you imagined. Chapter 3: Why More Never Feels Like Enough. There is a moment many people quietly wait for. A moment they imagine will arrive after the next achievement, the next milestone, the next version of themselves. It is the moment where everything finally feels complete. Where the pressure fades, the doubts settle, and a quiet sense of satisfaction takes its place. You tell yourself, when I reach that point, I'll finally feel at peace. And so you move forward, driven not only by desire, but by the hope that something inside you will finally resolve. At first, this belief feels motivating. It gives direction to your efforts and meaning to your struggle. You begin to organize your life around more success, more improvement, more recognition, more control. Each step forward feels like progress, and in many ways, it is. But alongside that progress, something subtle begins to happen. The moment you reach one level, your mind quietly adjusts the next one. The goal shifts, just slightly out of reach again. You may have experienced this without fully noticing it. You work toward something for months, maybe years. You imagine how it will feel once you arrive. And then, when it finally happens, there is a brief moment of satisfaction, real, but short-lived. Soon after, the feeling fades. Not because the achievement was meaningless, but because your mind has already begun looking ahead. It asks, what's next? And just like that, the sense of enough disappears again. This is not a personal failure. It is a pattern built into how the mind operates. The mind is designed to adapt. What once felt exciting becomes familiar. What once felt like progress becomes the new baseline. And from that baseline, the mind begins searching again for something more, something better, something that promises to complete the picture. But the picture is never complete because the mind keeps redrawing it. Imagine standing on a horizon that keeps moving as you walk toward it. No matter how far you go, the line in the distance remains just as far away. This is what chasing more often feels like. It creates the illusion of arrival, but never allows you to truly arrive. And over time, this can lead to a quiet exhaustion. Not because you are doing too little, but because you are constantly chasing a finish line that doesn't stay still. There is also a deeper emotional layer to this cycle. When more becomes the way you measure your life, your sense of worth becomes tied to constant improvement. You begin to believe that who you are right now is only acceptable if it leads to something better. Your present self becomes a stepping stone, not something to be fully experienced or appreciated. And because of that, even meaningful moments can feel incomplete. Think about how often you move quickly past things that once mattered to you. Achievements that once felt significant now feel ordinary. Progress that once felt exciting now feels expected. You may even struggle to feel proud of yourself because your focus has already shifted to the next goal. This doesn't mean you lack gratitude. It means your mind has been trained to keep moving, without ever pausing long enough to fully feel. This constant movement creates a quiet tension. A sense that you are always in transition, never fully settled. You are always becoming, but never being. And while growth is a natural part of life, without moments of stillness, it begins to feel like something you are chasing rather than something you are experiencing. The difference is subtle, but it changes everything. There is a story of a man who spent years building his career, believing that success would bring him a sense of stability and satisfaction. He worked long hours, made sacrifices, and gradually reached a point he once thought was far away. From the outside, his life looked complete. But inside, he felt the same quiet restlessness he had always felt. Not worse, but not better either. Just different circumstances, with the same underlying feeling. One evening, after a long day, he sat alone and asked himself a simple question. What exactly am I waiting for? He realized that every time he reached a goal, he replaced it with another, believing that the next one would finally be enough. but that moment never arrived. Not because he hadn't achieved enough, but because he had never questioned the belief that more was the solution. This realization did not remove his ambition. It changed his relationship with it. He began to see that growth and fulfillment are not the same thing. Growth is about movement. Fulfillment is about presence. And while they can exist together, one cannot replace the other. You can continue to grow endlessly, but without presence, the feeling of enough will always remain just out of reach. This is where a gentle shift begins. Instead of seeing more as the answer, you begin to see it as a tool. Something that can enhance your life, but not define your worth. You begin to separate your sense of value from your level of achievement. And in doing so, you create space for something that often gets overlooked, a direct experience of what already exists. This does not mean ignoring your goals or pretending you have no desires. It means allowing yourself to fully experience your life as it is, even as you continue to move forward. It means recognizing that the feeling of enough is not something you earn at the end of a journey. It is something you can access at any point if you are willing to pause and notice it. There is a quiet completeness in simple moments. In finishing a task and allowing yourself to feel it. In noticing progress without immediately turning it into pressure. In being present with where you are, without comparing it to where you think you should be. These moments may seem small, but they are where the feeling of enough actually lives. Not in the future, but in the present. Over time, this way of living begins to soften the constant drive for more. Not by removing ambition, but by balancing it with awareness. You still move forward, but not from a place of lack. You grow, but not because you are trying to fix yourself. You improve, but not because you believe you are incomplete. And in that shift, your efforts become lighter, more grounded, and more aligned with who you are. The cycle of more does not disappear completely. It is part of the human experience. But it loses its control over you. It becomes something you notice, rather than something that defines your life. And when that happens, something unexpected begins to emerge, a quiet sense of sufficiency that exists alongside your growth, rather than waiting at the end of it. And yet, even as you begin to understand this cycle, there is another force that quietly reinforces it. A force that constantly reminds you of what others are doing, what they have achieved, and how your life compares to theirs. Because the feeling of not enough is not only shaped by your own expectations, it is also shaped by how you see yourself in relation to others. And to understand that, we must look more closely at the illusion of other people's lives. Chapter 4: The Illusion of Other People's Perfect Lives. There is a quiet habit most people carry without noticing. It happens in small moments, while scrolling through a screen, while observing someone's life from a distance, while hearing about another person's success. You see a glimpse of someone else's world, and almost instantly, your mind begins to measure. Not loudly, not aggressively, but subtly. They seem ahead. They seem happier. They seem more complete. And without realizing it, your own life begins to feel slightly smaller in comparison. This process feels natural because it happens so quickly. You don't sit down and decide to compare. It simply appears. And the more often it appears, the more normal it begins to feel. You start to believe that understanding your life requires looking at others. That measuring yourself is a necessary part of growth. But what often goes unnoticed is that what you are comparing is not reality, it is a carefully filtered fragment of someone else's experience. Imagine walking past a house at night and looking through a single window. Inside, everything looks calm. The lighting is warm. The people inside seem relaxed. From that one view, it would be easy to assume that the entire house feels that way. But you don't see the rooms beyond that window. You don't see what happened earlier that day. You don't see the worries, the tensions, the quiet struggles that exist outside your line of sight. And yet, from that one glimpse, your mind creates a complete story. This is how comparison often works. You are not comparing your full life to someone else's full life. You are comparing your full experience, your thoughts, doubts, fears, and uncertainties, to a curated moment. A highlight. A surface-level image that does not carry the weight of everything beneath it. And because of that imbalance, the comparison almost always feels unfair, even if you don't consciously recognize why. There is a deeper layer to this illusion. When you observe others, your mind naturally fills in the gaps with assumptions. If someone appears confident, you assume they feel secure. If someone seems successful, you assume they feel fulfilled. If someone looks happy, you assume they are at peace. These assumptions are rarely questioned because they align with what you hope to feel. They represent a version of life that seems complete. But the truth is far more complex. Every person carries their own internal world, one that is not visible from the outside. Doubts that are never spoken. Pressures that are never shared. Moments of uncertainty that exist behind even the most composed appearances. Just as you have thoughts and feelings that others cannot see, so does everyone else. The difference is not in the experience itself, but in what is visible. There is a story of a woman who often compared her life to a colleague she admired. From the outside, the colleague seemed to have everything in place, a stable career, strong relationships, a sense of confidence that appeared effortless. Each time she observed this, she felt a quiet sense of inadequacy. Not overwhelming, but persistent. As if she was always just a few steps behind. One day, through an unexpected conversation, she learned something that shifted her perspective. The colleague she admired spoke openly about feeling uncertain, about questioning her own path, about moments of self-doubt that she had never shown. It was not dramatic. It was simply honest. And in that honesty, the image began to change. What once felt like perfection now felt human. Real. Complex. This moment did not remove comparison entirely, but it softened its intensity. It revealed something important, that what we often compare ourselves to is not the full truth. It is a version shaped by visibility, not reality. And once you begin to see that, the illusion starts to lose its power. There is also something else happening beneath comparison. It is not only about others, it is about what you believe those others represent. When you compare yourself to someone, you are often comparing yourself to a feeling you think they have. Confidence. Stability. Fulfillment. You are not just observing their life, you are projecting meaning onto it. And then, you measure your own life against that projection. This is why comparison can feel so personal. It is not just about what someone else has. It is about what you feel you are missing. And that feeling is shaped not by reality, but by interpretation. by the story your mind creates from limited information. Over time, this process can quietly shape your self-perception. You begin to see your life through a lens of lack. You notice what is absent more than what is present. You focus on what others seem to have, rather than what you are already experiencing. And gradually, your sense of enough becomes dependent on external reference points, points that are constantly changing. But what if those reference points were never stable to begin with? What if the lives you are comparing yourself to are also in motion, also evolving, also filled with unseen complexity? What if the sense of having it all together is not a permanent state, but a temporary appearance? When you begin to consider this, comparison starts to feel less like a reliable measure and more like an incomplete perspective. There is a quiet freedom in recognizing that you are not meant to live someone else's version of life. Not because it is unattainable, but because it was never yours to begin with. Your experiences, your pace, your path, they are shaped by factors that cannot be replicated or compared in a simple way. And when you try to measure them against someone else's, you lose sight of their uniqueness. This does not mean you stop observing others or learning from them. It means you change how you relate to what you see. Instead of turning observation into judgment, you allow it to become inspiration or information. You see others not as standards to measure yourself against, but as individuals on their own journeys. And in doing so, you return your focus to your own life. There is a subtle shift that happens when you stop using comparison as a tool for self-evaluation. Your attention moves inward. You begin to notice your own progress more clearly. You begin to appreciate moments that would have otherwise gone unnoticed. You start to feel a sense of grounding, not because your life has suddenly changed, but because your perspective has. This grounding creates space for something important, self-acceptance that is not dependent on external validation. A way of seeing yourself that is not constantly influenced by what others are doing. And from that space, the idea of enough becomes less fragile. It is no longer something that changes with every comparison. It becomes something more stable, more internal. But even as comparison begins to loosen its hold, another subtle force remains. A deeper fear that often sits beneath the need to measure yourself against others. A fear that if you stop comparing, if you stop striving to be more, you might become ordinary. And for many people, that idea feels uncomfortable. Even threatening. Because somewhere along the way, being ordinary started to feel like not being enough. And to understand that, we must explore a fear that is rarely spoken, but deeply felt, the fear of being average. Chapter 5, The Fear of Being Ordinary. There is a quiet discomfort that often sits beneath comparison, beneath striving, beneath the constant push to become more. It is not always obvious, and it rarely speaks directly. But if you listen closely, you can feel it. A subtle resistance to the idea of being ordinary. A hesitation, almost a fear, that if you are not exceptional in some way, your life might lose its meaning. And so, without fully realizing it, you begin to build your identity around standing out, achieving more, or becoming someone who is seen as different. This fear does not usually begin as something negative. In fact, it often grows from a natural desire to matter. To feel seen, valued, and recognized. As children, we learn quickly that certain behaviors receive attention, praise, or approval. When we do something well, we are noticed. When we stand out, we are remembered. And slowly, a connection begins to form between being special and being worthy. Not because anyone explicitly teaches it, but because it is quietly reinforced over time. As this pattern develops, the idea of being ordinary begins to take on a different meaning. It is no longer neutral. It starts to feel like being overlooked, unnoticed, or unimportant. And because no one wants to feel invisible, the mind begins to resist anything that resembles average. It pushes you toward distinction, toward achievement, toward anything that creates a sense of significance. Not always in a loud or obvious way, but in subtle, persistent choices. You may notice this in how you set your goals. Not just wanting to do something meaningful, but wanting it to be impressive. Not just wanting to grow, but wanting that growth to be recognized. There is nothing inherently wrong with these desires. But when they become tied to your sense of worth, they create a quiet pressure. A feeling that your life must be more than simple, more than steady, more than ordinary. There is a story of a man who spent years trying to build a life that would stand out. He pursued opportunities that looked impressive, took paths that others admired, and shaped his choices around what would make him feel significant. From the outside, it seemed like he was doing everything right. But internally, he felt a constant tension. No matter what he achieved, it never felt like enough to truly settle that need. One day, during a rare moment of stillness, he asked himself a question that felt almost uncomfortable. What if my life doesn't need to be extraordinary to be meaningful? At first, the idea felt unsettling. Almost like a loss. But as he sat with it, something began to shift. He realized that much of his effort had been driven not by genuine desire, but by a quiet fear of blending in. Of not being noticed. Of not being new enough unless he was exceptional. This realization did not remove his ambition. It changed the foundation beneath it. He began to see that there is a difference between living a meaningful life and living a life that appears meaningful from the outside. The first is internal, grounded in experience and connection. The second is external, shaped by perception and comparison. And while the second can feel powerful, it is often unstable, because it depends on how others see you. The fear of being ordinary often keeps you focused on the external. It encourages you to measure your life through visibility, recognition, and distinction. It tells you that your value increases when others notice you. And while this may bring temporary validation, it also creates a dependency. Because if your worth is tied to being seen as special, then any moment of normalcy can feel like a loss. But what if ordinary is not what you think it is? What if it is not a lack of value, but a space where value is no longer being constantly evaluated? A space where you can exist without needing to prove, perform, or compare. When you begin to look at it this way, ordinary life starts to reveal something different. Not emptiness, but depth. Not insignificance, but presence. Think about the moments that often go unnoticed. A quiet conversation. A simple routine. A moment of rest without urgency. These experiences may not stand out, but they carry a different kind of richness. One that is not dependent on recognition. One that does not need to be validated to be meaningful. And yet, because they are not dramatic or exceptional, they are often overlooked. The mind, shaped by the desire for distinction, tends to filter out these moments. It focuses on what is impressive, what is different, what is worth showing. And in doing so, it misses a large part of life, the part that is steady, consistent, and quietly fulfilling. The part that does not need to stand out to be real. This does not mean that striving for excellence is wrong. It means that excellence does not need to be tied to identity. You can pursue growth, create, achieve, and improve, not to escape being ordinary, but because it feels aligned with who you are. The difference is subtle, but it changes the emotional experience. One is driven by fear. The other is guided by intention. When you release the fear of being ordinary, you begin to experience life more directly. You are no longer constantly evaluating how things appear. You are more present with how things feel. Your actions become less about proving and more about expressing. And in that shift, something unexpected happens. The need to stand out begins to fade, and in its place, a quieter sense of authenticity begins to grow. There is a certain peace in allowing yourself to be part of life, rather than trying to rise above it. In recognizing that meaning does not come from being different from others, but from being connected to your experiences, your values, and your presence. This kind of meaning is not loud. It does not demand attention. But it is stable, because it does not depend on external validation. Over time, this perspective begins to reshape how you see yourself. You no longer feel the same urgency to prove your uniqueness. You no longer feel threatened by the idea of being like others. Instead, you begin to see that shared human experiences, uncertainty, growth, effort, rest, are not signs of limitation, but signs of connection. They remind you that you are not alone in your journey. And perhaps most importantly, you begin to see that your worth was never dependent on how extraordinary your life appears. It was never something that needed to be elevated or displayed. It was always present, even in the most ordinary moments. You simply hadn't been taught to recognize it there. This realization does not happen all at once. It unfolds gradually, through small shifts in awareness. Through moments where you choose presence over performance. Where you allow yourself to experience life without turning it into a comparison. And with each of these moments, the fear begins to lose its hold. But even as this fear softens, there is still something that many people find difficult. Even when they understand that they do not need to be extraordinary, even when they begin to accept themselves more fully, there is often a lingering discomfort. A difficulty in simply being with themselves, without distraction, without movement, without the need to become something else. Because for many people, the hardest thing is not achieving more or standing out. It is learning how to sit quietly with who they already are. And that is where the next part of this journey begins. Chapter 6: Learning to Sit with Yourself. There is a moment many people quietly avoid, even without realizing it. It is the moment when nothing is happening. No distractions, no tasks, no noise to fill the space. Just you, sitting with your own thoughts. For some, this moment feels peaceful. But for many, it feels uncomfortable, almost unfamiliar. The mind begins to search for something, anything, to engage with. A phone, a conversation, a task. Not because there is something urgent to do, but because being still with yourself can feel unexpectedly difficult. This difficulty is not a flaw. It is a reflection of how you have learned to relate to your inner world. For a long time, your attention has been directed outward, toward goals, expectations, comparisons, and movement. You have been encouraged to focus on what is next, what needs to improve, what needs to be achieved. And while this outward focus can be useful, it often leaves little space for something quieter, the experience of simply being with yourself, without needing to change anything. When you begin to sit with yourself, you may notice something surprising. The mind does not immediately become calm. Instead, it becomes more visible. Thoughts that were previously in the background begin to surface more clearly. Small worries, unfinished ideas, subtle doubts. It can feel as though sitting still has made your mind louder. But in reality, nothing new has appeared. You are simply noticing what was already there. This is often the moment where people pull away. They interpret this experience as discomfort that needs to be avoided. They return to distraction, to movement, to anything that creates distance from what they are feeling. But what if this discomfort is not something to escape, but something to understand? What if learning to sit with yourself is not about achieving calm immediately, but about becoming familiar with your own internal experience? There is a story of a woman who decided to spend a few minutes each day in silence, without any external input. At first, it felt simple. But within moments, her mind began to fill the space. Thoughts about what she should be doing, memories of past conversations, small worries about the future. She found herself reaching for her phone, almost automatically. Not because she needed it, but because the silence felt too exposed. Instead of giving in to that impulse, she paused. She stayed with the experience, even though it felt uncomfortable. And gradually, something began to change. The thoughts did not disappear, but her relationship to them shifted. She noticed that they came and went on their own. That they did not require her immediate attention. And that beneath the movement of her mind, there was a quieter layer of awareness that remained steady. This is the beginning of learning to sit with yourself. Not by forcing your mind to be quiet, but by allowing it to be as it is, without becoming entangled in every thought. It is a practice of observation, not control. A way of creating space between you and your mental activity, similar to what you began to explore in the first chapter. But now, instead of noticing this separation in brief moments, you begin to experience it more intentionally. As you continue, you may begin to notice patterns. Certain thoughts that appear more often. Certain emotions that surface when there is nothing else to distract you. You may realize that some of the discomfort you feel is not coming from the present moment, but from unresolved feelings that have been quietly carried forward. And for the first time, instead of avoiding them, you are allowing them to be seen. This can feel unfamiliar, even vulnerable. Because without distraction, there is nothing to hide behind. No immediate way to shift your attention outward. But within this vulnerability, there is also something important, a chance to understand yourself more deeply. To see not just the surface of your thoughts, but the patterns beneath them. The beliefs, the fears, the expectations that shape how you experience your life. There is a common misunderstanding that being alone with yourself means being isolated or disconnected. But in reality, learning to sit with yourself creates a different kind of connection, one that is internal rather than external. It allows you to become familiar with your own presence, without needing constant input or validation from the outside. And over time, this familiarity begins to feel less uncomfortable and more grounding. You begin to realize that you do not need to fill every moment. That silence is not empty, but spacious. That stillness is not a lack of activity, but a different kind of experience. One that allows you to notice what is often overlooked when your attention is constantly moving. This does not mean that your mind will always feel calm. There will still be moments of restlessness, moments where thoughts feel persistent or emotions feel strong. But instead of reacting to them immediately, you begin to create a pause. A small space where you can observe what is happening without needing to change it right away. And in that pause, something shifts. You are no longer being carried by every thought. You are no longer reacting automatically to every feeling. You are present with your experience, rather than controlled by it. And this presence creates a sense of stability that is not dependent on external circumstances. It comes from within, from your ability to remain with yourself, even when things feel uncertain. Over time, this practice begins to extend beyond moments of silence. You carry it into your daily life. Into conversations, into challenges, into moments of stress. You notice your thoughts more clearly. You respond more intentionally. You are less pulled into automatic reactions, and more grounded in awareness. And with that grounding comes a quieter form of confidence, not based on performance, but on presence. There is also a deeper shift that begins to take place. As you become more comfortable sitting with yourself, the need for constant distraction begins to soften. You no longer feel the same urgency to fill every gap, to avoid every moment of stillness. Instead, you begin to value these moments. Not because they are always easy, but because they allow you to reconnect with yourself in a way that nothing external can provide. This reconnection is not dramatic. It does not come with sudden clarity or immediate answers. It is subtle, gradual, and often quiet. But it is real. And it creates a foundation that supports everything else in your life. Because when you are comfortable with yourself, you are less dependent on external circumstances to feel stable. You are less influenced by comparison, by pressure, by the need to prove something. You begin to experience a different kind of relationship with your own mind. One that is not based on control or avoidance, but on understanding and acceptance. And from that relationship, a deeper sense of enough begins to grow. Not because everything is perfect, but because you are no longer trying to escape yourself. But as this awareness deepens, another layer often begins to surface. Because when you spend more time with yourself, you also come into contact with parts of your past, memories, regrets, and moments that you may have avoided or pushed aside. And while learning to sit with yourself allows you to face these experiences with more stability, it also brings a new challenge. How do you relate to the parts of your past that still feel unresolved? And more importantly, how do you begin to let go of the weight they carry? That is where the next step of this journey begins. Chapter 7. You are not your past mistakes. There is a quiet moment that often follows stillness. After you begin to sit with yourself, after the noise settles just enough for you to notice what lies beneath, something deeper starts to rise. Not always clearly, not always all at once, but gradually. Memories. Regrets. Moments you wish had gone differently. Things you said, things you didn't say, choices you would change if you could. And with them, a familiar feeling begins to return, the sense that something in your past still defines who you are. These moments can feel heavy, not because they are happening now, but because they have never fully been released. They remain unfinished in your mind, replayed in different forms, each time carrying the same underlying message. You should have known better. You should have done better. You should have been better. And over time, these thoughts begin to shape how you see yourself. Not as someone who made mistakes, but as someone who is the mistake. But there is an important distinction here, one that is easy to overlook. There is a difference between something you have done and who you are. A difference between an action and an identity. And yet, the mind often blurs this line. It takes a moment in time and turns it into a lasting label. A single experience becomes a definition. And once that happens, it becomes difficult to separate yourself from it. Think about how memory works. It does not simply record events, it interprets them. It assigns meaning, emotion, and significance. Over time, those interpretations become part of a larger story you tell yourself about who you are. If a mistake felt painful, the mind tries to make sense of it by creating a conclusion. And often, that conclusion is not gentle. It is not balanced. It is absolute. There is a story of a man who once made a decision that affected someone he cared about. At the time, he did not fully understand the impact of his actions. But later, when he saw the consequences, he was overwhelmed with regret. He replayed the moment again and again, imagining how things could have been different. And each time, the same thought returned, I shouldn't have done that. At first, this reflection seemed like growth. A way of learning from the past. But slowly, something else began to form. The thought shifted from I made a mistake to I am the kind of person who makes mistakes like this. The difference is subtle, but powerful. One is about an action. The other is about identity. And once identity becomes involved, the weight becomes much harder to carry. This is where many people get stuck. Not because they are unwilling to move forward, but because they believe they do not deserve to. The past becomes something that must be carried as a reminder, as a form of self-punishment, as a way of ensuring the same mistake is never repeated. And while this may feel responsible, it often creates a cycle where the past continues to define the present. But what if holding on to regret in this way is not actually helping you grow? What if growth does not come from carrying the weight of your past, but from understanding it, learning from it, and then allowing yourself to move beyond it? This does not mean ignoring what happened or pretending it did not matter. It means recognizing that the version of you who made that choice existed within a specific context, one shaped by your knowledge, your awareness, your emotional state at that time. You are not the same person now as you were then. Even if the difference feels small, it is there. The fact that you can look back and see things differently is itself a sign of growth. It means your awareness has changed. Your perspective has expanded. And yet, the mind often overlooks this. It judges the past version of you using the awareness you have now, as if you should have known then what you only understand now. This creates an impossible standard. One where you are expected to have been more aware than you were capable of being at the time. And because you fall short of that standard, the judgment continues. But if you step back, you can begin to see the imbalance. You were acting with the understanding you had then, not the understanding you have now. And that difference matters. There is a quiet form of compassion that becomes possible when you recognize this. Not a way of excusing your actions, but a way of seeing them more clearly. You begin to understand the conditions that led to those choices, the thoughts, the emotions, the limitations. And instead of reducing yourself to the mistake, you start to see the full picture. A human experience, shaped by growth, not defined by a single moment. This shift does not erase regret. You may still wish things had been different. You may still feel the weight of certain memories. But the relationship changes. The past becomes something you can learn from, rather than something that defines you. It becomes part of your story, not the entirety of it. There is also something else that often goes unnoticed. When you hold on to your past mistakes as part of your identity, you limit your ability to change. Because if you believe this is who I am, then any effort to grow feels like resistance rather than transformation. But when you begin to see yourself as something more fluid, more adaptable, growth becomes more natural. You are not a fixed version of yourself. You are a process. An ongoing experience shaped by awareness, reflection, and choice. And within that process, there is always room for change. Not in a way that erases the past, but in a way that integrates it. That allows it to inform you without defining you. There is a moment that can happen quietly, often without announcement. A moment where you realize that you have been holding on to something longer than necessary. A memory, a feeling, a judgment about yourself. And in that moment, you are faced with a choice. Not whether the past happened, but whether you will continue to carry it in the same way. Letting go does not mean forgetting. It means releasing the belief that you need to keep punishing yourself in order to grow. It means allowing yourself to move forward without constantly looking back for validation of your worth. And this is not always easy. Because the mind often confuses letting go with losing control. It believes that if you stop holding on to the mistake, you might repeat it. But growth does not come from fear. It comes from awareness. From understanding why something happened and choosing differently when similar moments arise. And this kind of learning does not require you to carry the full weight of your past. It requires you to be present enough to recognize patterns and aware enough to respond differently. As you begin to practice this, something begins to soften. The intensity of certain memories starts to fade. Not because they are gone, but because they no longer carry the same meaning. They become part of a larger narrative, one that includes growth, change, and understanding. And in that shift, a deeper sense of self begins to emerge. One that is not tied to past actions, but grounded in present awareness. A sense of identity that is not defined by what you have done, but by how you choose to move forward. This is where the idea of being enough becomes more real. Because as long as your identity is tied to past mistakes, you will always feel like something needs to be corrected before you can fully accept yourself. But when you begin to separate who you are from what you have done, that need begins to dissolve. You are not the worst thing you have done. You are not the sum of your past decisions. You are the awareness that has grown through those experiences. The one who can reflect, learn, and choose differently. And that is something that cannot be reduced to a single moment. But even as you begin to release the weight of your past, there is another layer that often remains. A deeper question that sits beneath identity, beneath mistakes, beneath growth. If your worth is not defined by your past, then where does it come from? And more importantly, is it something that needs to be earned at all? That is where the next part of this journey begins. Chapter 8: The Truth About Self-Worth. There is a question that sits quietly beneath so many of your thoughts, decisions, and emotions. It does not always appear in words, but it shapes how you experience your life. Am I enough? It is a question that follows you through different moments, when you succeed, when you struggle, when you compare, when you reflect. Sometimes it feels distant, almost unnoticeable. Other times, it feels immediate and heavy. But whether you are aware of it or not, much of what you do is influenced by how you answer it. For many people, the answer to that question feels conditional. It depends on what they have achieved, how they are perceived, or how closely they match an internal standard. If things are going well, the answer leans toward yes. If something falls short, the answer shifts toward no. And so, self-worth becomes something unstable, something that rises and falls with circumstances, rather than something that remains steady. This instability creates a quiet tension. Because if your worth can change based on outcomes, then you are always at risk of losing it. Every success brings temporary reassurance, but also the pressure to maintain it. Every mistake feels like a threat, not just to your progress, but to how you see yourself. And over time, this creates a constant need to prove, to validate, to confirm that you are still enough. But what if self-worth was never meant to work this way? What if your worth is not something that increases with success or decreases with failure, but something that exists independently of both? This idea can feel unfamiliar, even uncomfortable, because it challenges a belief that has likely been reinforced for a long time. The belief that you must earn your worth through effort, through improvement, through becoming more than you are right now. There is a story of a woman who spent years trying to build a sense of confidence through achievement. She believed that once she reached a certain level in her career, once she was recognized and respected, she would finally feel secure in herself. And for a while, it seemed to work. Each accomplishment brought a moment of validation. But those moments were always temporary. They faded, and when they did, the same underlying question returned. Eventually, she realized something that changed how she approached her life. The confidence she was building was tied to performance, not to her sense of self. It depended on external results, and because of that, it could never feel stable. It was always at risk of being lost. And as long as she relied on that form of confidence, she would continue to feel uncertain beneath the surface. This realization did not remove her desire to grow. It shifted where that growth was coming from. Instead of trying to build worth through achievement, she began to question whether her worth needed to be built at all. And in that question, something new began to emerge, a sense that worth might not be something you create, but something you recognize. This is where the understanding of self-worth begins to change. It moves away from the idea of accumulation, of adding value to yourself over time, and toward the idea of inherent value. The idea that your worth is not dependent on what you do, but on the fact that you exist. Not in a vague or abstract way, but in a very direct and immediate sense. Think about how you view other people. When you see someone struggling, you do not usually believe that they have lost their worth. You may see their difficulties, their mistakes, their imperfections, but you still recognize their humanity. You still understand that they matter, even if their circumstances are not ideal. And yet, when it comes to yourself, that same understanding is often missing. You hold yourself to a different standard. One where your worth must be justified, proven, maintained. One where you must continually earn the right to feel enough. But this standard is not neutral. It is learned. It is shaped by experiences, by expectations, by the way value has been presented to you over time. From a young age, you may have received messages, directly or indirectly, that linked your value to your behavior or performance. Praise when you did well. Disappointment when you didn't. Attention when you achieved something. Silence when you didn't. These patterns, repeated over time, begin to form a connection between worth and outcome. And without realizing it, you begin to carry that connection into your adult life. This does not mean those experiences were intentionally harmful. It means they were incomplete. They taught you how to evaluate performance, but not how to understand inherent value. And because of that, you learn to see yourself through a lens of conditions, rather than through a lens of presence. When you begin to question this, you may notice how deeply it is embedded in your thinking. You may feel a resistance to the idea that you are already enough, exactly as you are. The mind may respond with arguments, but I still need to improve, I still have goals, I am not where I want to be. And all of these can be true, without contradicting your worth. This is where a key distinction becomes important. Growth and worth are not the same thing. You can grow without needing to fix your value. You can improve without believing you are incomplete. You can move forward without using lack as your motivation. When you separate these ideas, your relationship with yourself begins to change. You no longer approach your life from a place of deficiency. You do not see yourself as something that needs to be constantly upgraded. Instead, you begin to see yourself as something that is already whole, but still evolving. And this perspective creates a very different emotional experience. One that is less driven by pressure and more supported by stability. There is a quiet confidence that comes from this understanding. Not the kind that depends on external validation, but the kind that comes from knowing that your value is not at stake. That no matter what happens, success or failure, approval or criticism, your worth remains intact. This does not make you passive. It makes you grounded. Because when your worth is not constantly being evaluated, you are free to act with more clarity. You are less influenced by the need to prove something. You are more aligned with what actually matters to you, rather than what validates you in the eyes of others. And in that alignment, your actions become more authentic, more intentional, and more sustainable. This does not mean that self-doubt disappears completely. There will still be moments where old patterns resurface, where you question yourself, where you feel uncertain. But now, those moments are seen differently. They are experiences, not definitions. They do not determine your worth. They simply reflect your current state. Over time, this shift begins to reshape how you relate to yourself. You become less critical, less reactive, less dependent on external feedback. You begin to treat yourself with a level of understanding that was previously reserved for others. And in doing so, you create a more stable foundation for everything else in your life. Because when you know that you are enough, not as a concept but as an experience, the need to constantly prove it begins to fade. You still care about your life. You still pursue growth. But the urgency changes. The pressure softens. And in that space, something deeper becomes possible. You begin to live not to become enough, but from a place of already being enough. And yet, even with this understanding, there is still one important piece that shapes how you experience yourself on a daily basis. The way you speak to yourself. The story you repeat internally. The narrative that quietly reinforces how you see who you are. Because even when your worth is constant, the way you perceive it can still be influenced by the story you tell yourself. And that is where the next step of this journey begins. Chapter 9: Rewriting the Story You Tell Yourself. There is a quiet story playing in your mind, almost all the time. It does not always speak in full sentences, and it rarely announces itself as a story. Instead, it appears as small interpretations, subtle conclusions, and repeated phrases that shape how you see yourself and your life. It tells you what your experiences mean. It explains your past. It predicts your future. And over time, it becomes so familiar that you stop noticing it as a story at all. It simply feels like the truth. This story is not created all at once. It is built gradually, through moments of experience and interpretation. A success becomes I am capable. A failure becomes I am not good enough. A rejection becomes I am not wanted. These interpretations may feel accurate in the moment, but they are not complete. They are fragments shaped by emotion and perspective. And when those fragments are repeated often enough, they begin to form a narrative, a consistent way of seeing yourself. The challenge is not that this story exists. The mind naturally tries to make sense of experiences. The challenge is that once the story is formed, it begins to filter everything that follows. New experiences are interpreted through the lens of what you already believe. If your story says you are not enough, your mind will quietly search for evidence to support that idea. It will notice the moments that confirm it, and overlook the ones that challenge it. There is a story of a man who believed, for most of his life, that he was not someone who could succeed. This belief did not come from a single event, but from a series of experiences where things did not go as planned. Over time, those experiences formed a narrative, "This is who I am." And because he believed it, he approached new opportunities with hesitation. He expected difficulty. He anticipated failure. And often, those expectations influenced his actions in subtle ways. One day, after reflecting on this pattern, he began to question something he had never considered before. What if this story is not fixed? At first, the idea felt uncertain. The story had been with him for so long that it felt like part of his identity. But as he continued to observe his thoughts, he noticed something important. The story was not always present. It appeared in certain moments, especially when he felt challenged or uncertain. And when it appeared, it influenced how he responded. This realization created a small but meaningful shift. Instead of automatically believing the story, he began to notice it. He began to see it as something that was being told, rather than something that simply was. And in that awareness, a new possibility emerged, the possibility of rewriting the narrative. Rewriting your story does not mean pretending that your past did not happen. It does not mean replacing every negative thought with a positive one. It means changing the way you interpret your experiences. It means recognizing that the meaning you have assigned to certain events is not the only possible meaning. And that you have the ability to see those events from a different perspective. Think about a moment from your past that you have labeled as a failure. For a long time, you may have seen it as evidence that you are not capable or not good enough. But what if you looked at that same moment through a different lens? What if it was not a definition of your ability, but a reflection of your circumstances at that time? What if it was not a final conclusion, but part of a process that contributed to your growth? This shift in perspective does not change what happened, but it changes what it means. And that change in meaning can have a powerful effect on how you see yourself. Because your identity is not built from events alone, it is built from how you interpret those events. There is a quiet power in recognizing that your story is not fixed. That it is not something you are bound to repeat, but something you can reshape over time. This does not happen instantly. It requires attention, reflection, and patience. But with each moment of awareness, the story begins to loosen its hold. You may notice that certain thoughts repeat themselves, especially in moments of uncertainty. Phrases like "I always mess this up," or "this never works out for me." These thoughts are not just random, they are expressions of your underlying narrative. And when you begin to notice them, you have an opportunity. Not to suppress them, but to question them. You can ask yourself, is this always true? Not in a confrontational way, but in a curious way. And often, you will find that the answer is no. There are moments that do not fit the story. Experiences that contradict it. But because they do not align with the narrative, they have been overlooked. As you begin to bring those moments into awareness, your story starts to expand. It becomes less rigid, less absolute. It begins to include a wider range of experiences, rather than focusing on a single pattern. And in that expansion, your sense of identity becomes more flexible. There is also something important to understand about the language you use internally. The words you repeat in your mind carry weight. They shape how you feel, how you respond, how you see yourself. When your inner dialogue is consistently critical or limiting, it reinforces a story of inadequacy. But when you begin to shift that language, even slightly, it can create a different emotional experience. This does not mean forcing yourself to think positively all the time. It means speaking to yourself with more accuracy, more balance, and more awareness. Instead of saying, "I am not good enough," you might notice that you are feeling uncertain. Instead of saying, "I always fail," you might recognize that something did not go as planned this time. These shifts may seem small, but they change the tone of your internal narrative. Over time, this practice begins to create a new story. One that is not based on extremes or absolutes, but on a more realistic and compassionate understanding of yourself. A story that allows for growth, for mistakes, for change. A story that reflects who you are becoming, rather than who you once believed you were. There is a moment that can happen gradually, often without a clear beginning or end. A moment where you realize that the way you see yourself has changed. Not dramatically, but subtly. You are less defined by past narratives. Less influenced by old conclusions. More open to new interpretations. And in that openness, your sense of self becomes more stable, not because it is fixed, but because it is no longer limited. This is where the idea of being enough becomes more integrated. Because as long as your story tells you that you are lacking, you will continue to feel that way, regardless of your circumstances. But when your story begins to reflect your inherent worth, your growth, and your potential, your experience of yourself begins to shift. You are no longer trying to prove something through your actions. You are expressing something that is already there. And this expression feels different. It is less driven by pressure and more guided by intention. Less about becoming and more about being. But even as your story begins to change, there is another aspect of your experience that continues to influence how you move through your life. Not just what you think, but how you feel. The way emotions arise, the way they move, and the way they sometimes take control. Because understanding your thoughts is one part of the journey. Learning how to relate to your emotions is another. And that is where the next step begins. Chapter 10: Emotional control is not suppression. There is a common belief that being emotionally strong means being unaffected. That if you are truly in control, you will not feel too much, react too quickly, or be overwhelmed by your emotions. And so, many people begin to approach their inner world with a quiet strategy: keep things contained, stay composed, do not let emotion show too much. On the surface, this can look like stability. But beneath it, something else is often happening. Emotions are not disappearing. They are being held back, pushed aside, or quietly ignored. At first, this approach can feel effective. You remain calm in difficult situations. You avoid uncomfortable feelings. You maintain a sense of control. But over time, something begins to build beneath that control. Unprocessed emotions do not simply fade away. They stay within your system, waiting for attention. And when they are repeatedly suppressed, they often return in different forms: unexpected irritation, quiet anxiety, or a sense of heaviness that is difficult to explain. This is where a misunderstanding begins to reveal itself. Emotional control is often mistaken for emotional suppression. But the two are very different. Suppression is about resisting what you feel. Control, in its deeper sense, is about understanding and relating to what you feel without being consumed by it. One avoids emotion. The other allows it, but does not surrender to it. There is a story of a man who prided himself on staying composed. No matter what happened, he kept his emotions in check. He rarely expressed frustration, rarely showed vulnerability, and rarely allowed himself to feel deeply. To others, he appeared calm and steady. But internally, he felt disconnected. There was a sense that something was missing, though he could not clearly define what it was. One day, after a particularly stressful period, that calm began to break. Small frustrations felt larger than they should have. Minor inconveniences triggered stronger reactions. And emotions that had been held back for a long time began to surface all at once. It was confusing, even unsettling. Because for so long, he believed that controlling his emotions meant keeping them out of sight. What he began to realize, slowly and gradually, was that his emotions had never been resolved. They had simply been postponed. And because they had not been acknowledged or understood, they had accumulated beneath the surface. The control he had practiced was not stability, it was avoidance. This realization can feel uncomfortable, because it challenges a deeply ingrained habit. Many people have learned, directly or indirectly, that certain emotions are not acceptable. That showing sadness is a weakness. That expressing anger is a problem. That vulnerability is something to be hidden. And so, instead of learning how to process these emotions, they learn how to manage their appearance. But emotions are not problems to be hidden. They are signals. They reflect your internal experience, your reactions to situations, your needs, your boundaries. When you suppress them, you are not removing the signal, you are ignoring it. And over time, this creates a disconnect between what you feel and how you respond. Learning to relate to your emotions in a healthier way begins with a simple but often overlooked step, allowing them to exist. Not analyzing them immediately. Not trying to change them right away. But simply noticing them, without resistance. This does not mean acting on every emotion. It means acknowledging that the emotion is present, without denying or minimizing it. You might notice a feeling of frustration. Instead of pushing it away or reacting impulsively, you pause. You recognize it. You allow it to be there, without immediately turning it into action. This creates a space between the emotion and your response. And within that space, you have a choice. This is where emotional control begins to take a different form. It is not about eliminating the emotion. It is about not being controlled by it. You feel the emotion fully, but you do not let it dictate your behavior automatically. You remain present with it, aware of it, and from that awareness, you choose how to respond. There is a subtle shift that happens when you approach emotions this way. They begin to move through you, rather than stay stuck within you. Because emotions, by their nature, are temporary. They rise, they peak, and they pass. But when they are suppressed, they do not complete this process. They remain unresolved, often returning later in a different form. Think of emotions like waves. When you allow them to rise and fall naturally, they pass through without leaving a lasting disruption. But when you resist them, it is like trying to hold the wave in place. It becomes stagnant, heavier, more difficult to move. And over time, that resistance creates more tension than the emotion itself. There is also something important to understand about intensity. Sometimes emotions feel overwhelming, not because they are too strong, but because they have been held back for too long. When they finally surface, they carry the weight of everything that has been suppressed. And in those moments, it can feel like too much. But even in those moments, the same principle applies. Instead of trying to control the emotion by pushing it away, you begin by acknowledging it. You allow yourself to feel it, without immediately reacting. You give it space to exist, without turning it into something it is not. And gradually, the intensity begins to shift. This process requires patience. It is not about changing your emotional experience overnight. It is about building a different relationship with it over time. One that is based on awareness rather than avoidance. One that allows emotions to be part of your experience, without letting them define it. There is a quiet strength in this approach. Not the strength of suppression, but the strength of presence. The ability to remain with your experience, even when it is uncomfortable. The ability to feel deeply, without losing your sense of stability. And this kind of strength is not rigid. It is flexible, responsive, and grounded. As you continue to practice this, you may notice that your emotional reactions begin to change. Not because you are forcing them to, but because you are no longer amplifying them through resistance. You are allowing them to move naturally, which reduces their intensity over time. And in that process, you begin to trust your ability to handle what you feel. This trust is important. Because much of emotional avoidance comes from a belief that certain feelings are too much to handle. That if you allow them fully, they will overwhelm you. But as you begin to experience them with awareness, you realize that they are not as permanent or as uncontrollable as they once seemed. You begin to see that emotions are part of your experience, not something separate from it. They do not need to be feared or suppressed. They need to be understood. And when they are understood, they lose much of their power to disrupt. This understanding also changes how you relate to others. When you are more aware of your own emotions, you become more sensitive to the emotional experiences of those around you. You respond with more clarity, more patience, and less reactivity. Your interactions become more grounded because you are not carrying unresolved tension into them. And in this way, emotional awareness becomes more than an internal skill. It becomes part of how you move through the world. How you connect, how you respond, how you navigate challenges. It becomes a foundation for a more balanced and stable way of living. But even as you begin to understand your emotions more deeply, there is another layer that often influences how you experience them. Not just the emotions themselves, but the need for others to validate them. The desire for approval, reassurance, or recognition that what you feel is acceptable. Because for many people, emotional stability is not only challenged by what they feel internally, but also by how they believe others see them. And to understand that, we must explore the role of approval, and how letting go of the need for it changes everything. Chapter 11: Letting go of the need for approval. There is a quiet question that often sits behind your choices, your words, and even your silence. It does not always appear clearly, but it shapes your behavior in subtle ways. Is this okay? Will they accept this? Will they approve of me? You may not ask it directly, but you feel it. In the way you adjust your tone, in the way you filter your thoughts, in the way you hesitate before expressing something true. It is the quiet pull toward approval, the desire to be seen as acceptable, likable, or worthy in the eyes of others. At first, this desire seems natural. Humans are social by nature. We seek connection, understanding, and belonging. Approval, in many ways, feels like confirmation that we are part of something, that we are accepted within our environment. And in healthy forms, this need for connection can support relationships and cooperation. But when approval becomes the foundation of how you see yourself, it begins to shape your life in ways that are often invisible. You may begin to notice how often your decisions are influenced by how they will be perceived. Not just the larger decisions, but the small, everyday ones. What you say, what you hold back, how you present yourself. You begin to adjust, to adapt, to align yourself with what you believe will be accepted. And over time, this adaptation can become so automatic that it feels like your natural way of being. But beneath this adaptation, there is often a quiet tension. A sense that you are not fully expressing yourself. That certain parts of you are being softened, hidden, or reshaped to fit expectations. And while this may create a sense of short-term harmony, it can also create a deeper feeling of disconnection, not from others, but from yourself. There is a story of a woman who was known for being agreeable. She rarely disagreed, rarely expressed strong opinions, and was often seen as easy to be around. From the outside, her relationship seemed smooth. But internally, she felt a constant strain. She often found herself saying yes when she meant no, agreeing when she felt uncertain, and adjusting her behavior to avoid conflict or disapproval. Over time, this pattern began to wear on her. Not because others were demanding it, but because she had learned to anticipate what would be accepted and shaped herself accordingly. One day, after reflecting on this pattern, she asked herself a simple but difficult question. What would I say if I wasn't trying to be approved of? At first, the answer was unclear. The habit of seeking approval had become so ingrained that it was difficult to separate her true response from the one she believed was expected. But as she began to pause more often, to notice her impulses before acting on them, something began to shift. She started to recognize the moments where she was adjusting herself, not out of genuine agreement, but out of a desire to be accepted. This awareness did not immediately change her behavior. But it created a space, a moment between impulse and action. And within that space, she had a choice. Not always an easy one, but a conscious one. To respond in a way that felt true to her, rather than simply acceptable to others. This is where the process of letting go of approval begins. Not by rejecting connection or ignoring others, but by recognizing where your sense of self has become dependent on their validation. It is a gradual process, one that unfolds through awareness rather than force. Because the need for approval is not something that disappears instantly. It is something that softens over time as your internal stability grows. There is an important distinction to understand here. Letting go of the need for approval does not mean you stop caring about others. It does not mean you become indifferent or disconnected. It means your sense of worth is no longer determined by how others respond to you. You can still value relationships, still listen, still adapt when it feels appropriate. But you are no longer shaped entirely by the expectation of approval. This shift begins to change how you experience interactions. You are less focused on managing perceptions and more focused on being present. You listen more fully, not because you are trying to respond in a certain way, but because you are genuinely engaged. You speak more honestly, not because you are trying to be different, but because you are no longer filtering everything through the lens of acceptance. At times, this can feel uncomfortable. Because when you step outside of approval-based behavior, you may encounter reactions that are unfamiliar. Not everyone will agree with you. Not everyone will respond positively. And for a moment, this can feel unsettling, especially if you are used to maintaining harmony through adaptation. But within this discomfort, there is also something important. A sense of authenticity. A feeling that your actions are aligned with your internal experience, rather than shaped by external expectations. And over time, this alignment begins to feel more stable than approval itself. There is also something else that begins to change. As you rely less on external validation, you begin to develop a stronger sense of internal validation. Not in a way that is rigid or self-centered, but in a way that is grounded. You begin to trust your own perspective more. You begin to respect your own boundaries. And you begin to recognize that your experience is valid, even if it is not confirmed by others. This internal validation does not eliminate uncertainty. There will still be moments where you question yourself, where you seek feedback, where you value the input of others. But the difference is that your sense of self is not dependent on their response. It is informed by it, but not defined by it. Over time, this creates a more stable foundation for your relationships. Because when you are not constantly seeking approval, your interactions become more genuine. You are not trying to be what others expect. You are simply being present as you are. And this authenticity often leads to deeper, more meaningful connections, ones that are based on honesty rather than adaptation. There is also a quiet freedom in this way of living. A sense that you are no longer performing, no longer adjusting every part of yourself to fit a certain image. You are able to move through your life with more ease, not because everything is perfect, but because you are not constantly evaluating how you are being perceived. This freedom does not come from withdrawing from others. It comes from returning to yourself. From recognizing that your worth is not something that needs to be confirmed externally. It is something that exists regardless of how others respond. And when you truly begin to understand this, the need for approval begins to lose its intensity. It does not disappear completely. There will still be moments where you feel it, where you notice the impulse to adjust or seek validation. But now, you recognize it. You see it as a pattern, not as a necessity. And in that recognition, you have the ability to choose differently. You can choose to respond from your own understanding, rather than from expectation. You can choose to express yourself honestly, even when it feels uncertain. You can choose to trust your own experience, even when it is not validated by others. And with each of these choices, your sense of self becomes more stable, more grounded, more aligned with who you are. This is where the idea of being enough becomes more embodied. Because when you are no longer relying on approval to confirm your worth, you begin to experience that worth more directly. Not as something that needs to be proven, but as something that is already present. And from that place, a different kind of confidence begins to emerge. Not loud or attention-seeking, but quiet and steady. A confidence that does not depend on recognition, but on trust. And to understand that kind of confidence more deeply, we must explore what it truly means to believe in yourself, not as a performance, but as a way of being. Chapter 12, Building Quiet Confidence. There is a kind of confidence that does not announce itself. It does not need to be seen, recognized, or confirmed. It does not depend on how others respond, or on how things appear from the outside. It is quiet, steady, and often invisible to anyone except the person who carries it. And yet, it is one of the most powerful forms of confidence you can develop. Not because it stands out, but because it remains stable, even when everything around you feels uncertain. This kind of confidence is very different from what is often portrayed. It is not about always knowing what to say, or never feeling doubt. It is not about being the most capable, the most accomplished, or the most admired. It is not built through constant success, nor is it dependent on recognition. Instead, it is built through a deeper relationship with yourself, one that is grounded in trust rather than performance. For many people, confidence has been linked to external outcomes. You feel confident when things go well, when you are prepared, when you are certain of the result. And when those conditions are not present, confidence begins to fade. This creates a fragile form of self-belief, one that depends on control. If you can manage the situation, you feel secure. If you cannot, doubt begins to rise. But quiet confidence does not require control. It does not come from knowing exactly what will happen. It comes from knowing that whatever happens, you will be able to respond. Not perfectly, not without difficulty, but with awareness and resilience. It is not confidence in outcomes. It is confidence in your ability to navigate them. There is a story of a man who was asked to take on a responsibility he had never handled before. His first reaction was uncertainty. He did not feel ready. He did not feel fully capable. But instead of stepping back, he paused and considered something different. Not whether he would succeed without mistakes, but whether he trusted himself to learn, to adapt, and to continue even if things did not go as planned. This shift in perspective changed how he approached the situation. He no longer needed to feel completely confident before beginning. He only needed to trust that he could handle what came next. And as he moved forward, that trust began to grow, not because everything went smoothly, but because he saw himself respond, adjust, and continue. This is how quiet confidence develops. Not through perfection, but through experience. Through moments where you face uncertainty and remain present. Through situations where you do not have all the answers, but you continue anyway. And with each of these moments, a deeper sense of trust begins to form. Not in your ability to control everything, but in your ability to remain steady within it. There is also something important to understand about doubt. Quiet confidence does not remove doubt completely. You may still feel uncertain, still question yourself, still hesitate at times. But the relationship with doubt changes. It no longer defines your actions. It becomes part of your experience, rather than a barrier to it. Instead of waiting for doubt to disappear, you begin to move with it. You recognize that uncertainty is not a sign that you are incapable. It is a natural part of engaging with something new or meaningful. And when you stop treating doubt as a signal to stop, it begins to lose its power. This shift allows you to take action from a different place. Not from the need to prove yourself, but from a sense of alignment. You act because something feels right, not because you need validation. You move forward not because you are certain, but because you trust your ability to respond. There is a quiet strength in this way of moving through life. It is not reactive. It is not driven by external pressure. It is steady, grounded, and intentional. And over time, it begins to influence how you see yourself. You start to recognize that your value is not tied to outcomes, but to your presence within them. This recognition creates a more stable form of confidence. One that does not fluctuate with success or failure. One that remains, even when things are unclear. And because of that stability, you become less dependent on external reassurance. You no longer need constant confirmation that you are capable. You begin to feel it from within. There is also a subtle change in how you approach challenges. Instead of seeing them as tests of your worth, you begin to see them as opportunities to engage, to learn, to experience. This does not remove difficulty. But it removes the added pressure of needing to prove something. And without that pressure, your responses become more natural, more flexible, and more effective. Quiet confidence also changes how you relate to others. When your sense of self is not dependent on comparison or approval, your interactions become less guarded. You are more open, more present, and less concerned with how you are being perceived. This creates a different kind of connection, one that is based on authenticity rather than performance. You may notice that you listen more fully, speak more honestly, and respond more thoughtfully. Not because you are trying to be a certain way, but because you are no longer filtering everything through the lens of validation. And in this way, your relationships become more grounded, more genuine, and more aligned with who you are. There is also a sense of ease that begins to develop. Not because everything is easy, but because you are not constantly managing how you appear. You are not adjusting yourself to fit expectations or seeking reassurance in every interaction. You are simply present, responding as you are, without the need to control every outcome. This ease does not mean passivity. You still care, still engage, still grow. But the energy behind your actions is different. It is less driven by pressure and more supported by trust. And this makes your efforts more sustainable, because they are not constantly tied to external feedback. Over time, this way of being becomes more natural. You no longer have to remind yourself to trust yourself. It becomes part of how you experience your life. You begin to feel a sense of stability that is not easily shaken by external changes. And within that stability, there is a quiet confidence that does not need to be reinforced. But like everything else in this journey, this confidence is not something you achieve once and hold permanently. It is something you continue to build, through awareness, through experience, through the way you respond to yourself in different moments. There will still be times when you feel uncertain, when old patterns resurface, when doubt feels stronger than trust. And in those moments, the practice continues. You return to awareness. You notice the shift. And you choose, again, to trust your ability to navigate what is in front of you. Because quiet confidence is not about never losing your balance. It is about knowing that you can regain it. And as this confidence becomes more integrated, another shift begins to take place. You start to move through life with less urgency, less pressure to constantly catch up or prove something. You begin to question the pace you have been living at, and whether it truly reflects your own rhythm. Because when your worth is no longer tied to outcomes or approval, the need to rush begins to fade. And that opens the door to a different way of living, one that is not driven by pressure, but guided by presence. Chapter 13: Living without constant pressure. There is a pace that many people learn to live at without ever questioning it. It feels urgent, slightly rushed, always leaning toward what comes next. Even in moments that are meant to be calm, there is often an underlying tension, a sense that something should be happening, that time is moving, that you might be falling behind if you are not careful. This pressure is not always loud. It does not always demand attention. But it quietly shapes how you experience your life. You may notice it in small ways. The way you check the time, even when there is no immediate deadline. The way you feel the need to fill empty moments with activity. The way rest sometimes feels uncomfortable, as if it needs to be justified. This constant pressure does not come from a single source. It is built over time, influenced by expectations, comparisons, and the belief that your life should be progressing at a certain speed. From an early stage, you are introduced to timelines. When things should happen. Where you should be at certain points. What success looks like at different stages of life. These timelines are often presented as guidance, but they can easily become something more rigid. They begin to feel like standards, benchmarks that define whether you are on track or falling behind. And once these standards are internalized, they begin to shape your perception of time. Life becomes something to keep up with, rather than something to experience. You begin to measure your progress against an imagined schedule, one that does not always reflect your reality. And because of that, there is often a quiet sense of urgency, even when there is no immediate reason for it. There is a story of a man who always felt like he was behind. No matter what he accomplished, there was a persistent sense that he should have done more by now. He compared his progress to others, to expectations, to an internal timeline that he had never fully examined. And because he felt behind, he moved through his life with a constant pressure to catch up. One day, during a conversation with a friend, he was asked a simple question. Behind what? At first, he didn't have an answer. The feeling was clear, but the reference point was not. And as he thought about it, he began to realize that the timeline he was measuring himself against was not something he had consciously chosen. It was something he had absorbed, an idea of how life should look, rather than how it actually unfolds. This realization did not immediately remove the pressure, but it created a space to question it. And in that space, something began to shift. He started to see that his life was not late or early. It was simply unfolding at its own pace. And that pace, while different from others, was not inherently wrong. Living without constant pressure does not mean ignoring responsibility or avoiding growth. It means changing your relationship with time and expectation. It means recognizing that your life is not a race with a fixed finish line, but a process that unfolds in ways that are often unpredictable and unique. When you begin to see life this way, the urgency starts to soften. You are still moving forward, still engaging, still growing. But the energy behind your actions changes. It is no longer driven by the fear of falling behind. It is guided by a sense of presence and alignment. There is a difference between movement that comes from pressure and movement that comes from intention. Pressure creates tension. It pushes you forward, but often at the cost of your experience. Intention, on the other hand, creates clarity. It allows you to move forward with purpose, without the constant need to prove something. You may begin to notice how often pressure is connected to comparison. The sense that others are ahead, that you need to match their pace, that your progress is somehow insufficient. But as you explored earlier, these comparisons are often based on incomplete information. They do not reflect the full complexity of your life or the lives of others. When you let go of this comparison, even slightly, your relationship with time begins to change. You are less focused on where you should be, and more aware of where you are. And in that awareness, you begin to experience your life more directly, rather than constantly evaluating it. There is also something important about rest that often gets overlooked. In a culture that values constant activity, rest can feel like a pause in progress. Something that needs to be minimized or justified. But rest is not separate from progress. It is part of it. It allows your mind and body to reset, to integrate, to recover. When you begin to allow rest without attaching guilt to it, you create a different rhythm in your life. One that includes both movement and stillness. And in that rhythm, there is less pressure because you are no longer trying to maintain a constant state of productivity. This does not mean you stop caring about your goals. It means you approach them differently. You allow yourself to move toward them at a pace that is sustainable, rather than driven by urgency. You focus on consistency rather than speed. And in doing so, you create progress that is more stable and less exhausting. There is a quiet shift that happens when you release the need to rush. Time begins to feel less like something you are chasing and more like something you are moving with. You become more present in your actions, more aware of your experience, and less focused on what comes next. This presence does not remove challenges or uncertainty, but it changes how you relate to them. You are not constantly anticipating the future or evaluating the past. You are engaged with what is in front of you. And from that engagement, your actions become more effective because they are grounded in awareness rather than urgency. Over time, this way of living begins to create a sense of calm that is not dependent on external conditions. A steadiness that comes from knowing that you are not behind, not late, not missing something. You are simply where you are, moving forward in your own way. This realization does not happen all at once. It unfolds gradually, through moments of awareness and choice. Each time you notice the pressure and question it. Each time you allow yourself to slow down without guilt. Each time you choose intention over urgency. And with each of these moments, the pressure begins to lose its hold. You may still feel it at times. The urge to speed up, to compare, to evaluate your progress. But now, you recognize it. You see it as a pattern, not a truth. And in that recognition, you have the ability to respond differently. You can pause. You can breathe. You can return your attention to the present moment, rather than the imagined timeline. And in doing so, you create space for a different experience, one that is less driven by pressure and more supported by presence. This is where the idea of being enough becomes more fully lived. Because when you are no longer measuring yourself against time, you are no longer trying to prove that you are on track. You are simply moving forward, with awareness, with intention, with trust. And in that way of living, there is a quiet sense of freedom. Not because everything is resolved, but because you are no longer carrying the weight of constant urgency. But even as this pressure begins to soften, there is one final realization that brings everything together. A deeper understanding that goes beyond thoughts, beyond emotions, beyond patterns. A realization that changes how you see yourself, not as something that needs to be improved, but as something that is already whole. And that is where this journey begins to come full circle. Chapter 14, Becoming Enough Without Changing Who You Are. There is a moment in this journey where something begins to shift in a very quiet, almost unnoticeable way. It is not a sudden realization or a dramatic breakthrough. It is more like a soft understanding that settles beneath everything you have been exploring. A sense that perhaps the thing you have been trying to become is not something you need to become at all. That maybe the feeling of enough is not waiting for you somewhere in the future, but has been quietly present all along. For a long time, the idea of becoming enough has likely been tied to change, to improvement, to reaching a certain version of yourself that finally feels complete. You may have believed that once you fix certain flaws, achieve certain goals, or become more confident, more disciplined, or more successful, then you will arrive at a place where you can finally feel at peace with who you are. This belief is subtle, but powerful. It keeps you moving, striving, and evolving. And while growth is a natural and meaningful part of life, there is a hidden assumption within this belief that who you are right now is not yet sufficient. That your current self is something to be improved before it can be accepted. And because of this, acceptance is always delayed, always postponed until some future version of you is reached. But what if that future version is not where enough exists? What if the sense of completeness you are searching for is not dependent on becoming someone different, but on recognizing something about who you already are? There is a story of a man who spent years trying to improve himself. He read, learned, practiced, and worked constantly toward becoming a better version of himself. And in many ways, he succeeded. He became more capable, more aware, more disciplined. But despite all of this progress, there was still a quiet sense of incompleteness that followed him. One day, during a moment of reflection, he realized something that had been hidden beneath all of his effort. He had been improving himself not just to grow, but to reach a point where he could finally accept himself. His growth had been driven by a quiet condition: I will be enough when I become better. And because that condition was always tied to the future, the feeling of enough never fully arrived. This realization did not stop his desire to grow, but it changed how he related to it. He began to see that growth and acceptance do not need to be separate. That you do not need to reject who you are in order to evolve. That you can move forward without leaving your current self behind. This is where the idea of becoming enough without changing who you are begins to take shape. It is not about staying the same or resisting growth. It is about removing the belief that your worth is dependent on change. It is about recognizing that your value is not something you build over time, but something that exists as a constant, regardless of where you are in your journey. This perspective can feel unfamiliar because it goes against a deeply ingrained pattern. The pattern of self-improvement as a form of self-correction. The idea that there is something fundamentally lacking that needs to be fixed. But when you begin to question this pattern, you may notice something important. Much of your effort has been directed toward becoming someone else, rather than understanding who you already are. And when you shift your attention in that direction, something begins to unfold. You start to see yourself more clearly. Not as a list of things to improve, but as a complete experience: thoughts, emotions, strengths, limitations, all existing together. And within that experience, there is no single part that defines your worth. There is a quiet acceptance that begins to grow. Not because everything is perfect, but because you are no longer measuring yourself against an ideal. You are no longer comparing your current self to a future version that you believe will finally be enough. You are simply present with who you are, without the need to immediately change it. This does not mean you stop evolving. It means your evolution comes from a different place. Not from a sense of lack, but from a sense of curiosity and alignment. You grow not because you are trying to fix yourself, but because you are exploring what feels meaningful, what feels true to you. There is a subtle but powerful difference between these two approaches. When growth is driven by lack, it carries pressure. It feels urgent, necessary, and often exhausting. When growth is driven by alignment, it feels natural. It unfolds without the same sense of tension, because it is not trying to fill a gap, it is expressing something that is already there. You may begin to notice this in your own life. The difference between actions that feel forced and actions that feel aligned. The difference between pushing yourself to become something and allowing yourself to move in a direction that feels right. And as you become more aware of this, your relationship with growth begins to change. You no longer see your current self as a problem to solve. You see it as a foundation to build from. And in that shift, the feeling of enough becomes more accessible, because it is no longer tied to a condition that must be met. There is also something deeply relieving about this realization. The sense that you do not need to constantly evaluate yourself, to measure your progress, to check whether you have become enough yet. You are no longer waiting for permission to feel complete. You begin to experience it directly, in moments of presence, in moments of awareness. This does not mean that all self-doubt disappears. There will still be moments where old patterns return, where you question yourself, where you feel the pull toward improvement as a form of validation. But now, you recognize these patterns. You see them for what they are, habits of thinking, not truths about your worth. And in that recognition, you have the ability to respond differently. Not by rejecting growth, but by removing the condition attached to it. You can continue to evolve, to learn, to expand, without needing those changes to define your value. This is where everything begins to come together. The awareness of your thoughts, the understanding of your emotions, the release of comparison, the letting go of approval, the development of quiet confidence, all of it leads to this point. A recognition that your worth has never been something you needed to earn. You have always been enough, even in the moments where you felt the opposite. Not because you have reached a certain level, but because your value was never dependent on levels to begin with. And when this understanding begins to settle, something changes in how you experience your life. There is less tension, less urgency, less need to prove. There is more presence, more clarity, more ease. You are no longer chasing a version of yourself that will finally feel complete. You are simply living from a place that already is. This is not the end of growth. It is the beginning of a different kind of growth, one that is not driven by lack, but supported by wholeness. One that allows you to expand without losing yourself in the process. And from this place, a final realization begins to emerge. A way of living that brings everything together, not as separate ideas, but as a unified experience. A life where you are no longer trying to become enough, but living fully from the understanding that you already are.